Chromanoids. 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 Chromanoids.
Hello, Atif Akin is an artist and designer living in New York, and you are particularly obsessed with techno-scientific lens in the way that you are describing always your work. I would like to begin with, are you human?
Oh, yeah, I mean, as much as everyone else, I guess.
Okay, your project for the Biennial Mutant Space spans across vast amount of time, no? Encompassing past, present, and even future, among radioactive spaces. How did you conceive this role of temporalities in your work?
Yeah, I mean, the time span is like really, really vast because, when you start about the nuclear technology and radioactive mobility, like, first of all, you have to start thinking about like when this uranium mines have been started and like, when, how long it dates back, and also the waste that we create out of it, which lasts around like 240,000 years, so which creates like a huge time span to think about. And then the conditions in which we can contain the waste even takes this time span further, and which started developing a lot of interesting stories, like starting from the Ice Age, which in Finland they're trying to build these nuclear waste site repositories dug into the oldest bedrock of the Earth, which dates back to a couple of billion years in geologic time. And then when you come to our neighbor Armenia, you see the juxtaposition of the nuclear time with the archaeologic time, because the nuclear waste is stored at the archaeologic space, at the archaeologic height. And so which made me thinking about all these like space and time juxtapositions between archaeology, geology, and nuclear science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually extremely interesting that you are defining these radioactive spaces as archaeological sites.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of protocols and approaches are specific of these kind of archaeological procedures?
Well, I mean, these are archaeological sites for the future because these are the longest living artifacts that we are creating right now, although now we treat them as waste. But a couple of thousand years later, they'll still be surviving when we're all gone, and then they will be the archaeology of the future. So, of course, like I cannot speculate about like what's going to be the archaeological methodology is going to look like 240,000 years later, as I'm not a physicist nor an archaeologist. But I guess they'll still be digging like we are doing. So, at some point, there will be like interesting, juxtapositions, and while people are looking for archaeology, they'll be finding our nuclear waste, and so they'll be like thinking of what the hell they were thinking about while doing this.
You are claiming that you want the viewer just to see your not only your project but their environments themselves through atoms, layers, radioactive design, and even time. What do you expect? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, throughout the research, I've been exploring different kinds of visualizations, and of course, like photography and video are the basic forms of documentation. But in the meantime, I also tried to develop like scientific methods of visualizing this atomic mobility, in which it's not really like high tech, but I've been referring to the atomic models of Rutherford, like from 1950s, 60s, which are still valid. And actually, nuclear science is not something which is constantly progressing itself. It's kind of stalled in 1980s. Mm-hmm. So if you refer back to the nuclear research methodologies in 1950s and 60s, that's pretty much it. So I've been using Geiger counters. I've been using simple connectors that I can hook up Geiger counters with the computers, and I've been drawing maps of these atoms. Scientifically, they're like 1960s, and at some point I was a little disappointed because I was trusting my computer a lot, and I think I'm a good computer user, but I realized that actually atoms and the nuclear mobility is much faster than the computers, the fastest ones that I can build. So now I have to go back and like find different ways of visualizing the nuclear mobility. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of different ways of visualizing this phenomenon, and formally, should I keep going, or maybe yeah, okay. Formally, it ended up in a form of different sets of animations, and throughout this thinking process, I'm also inspired by the myths. And at some point, my paths crossed with Noah's Ark, which is believed to be landed in the Ararat, which is next to the area that I'm researching in Metsamor. And so, that's the first human catastrophe as we know. And so I decided to design everything almost like containing in a Noah's Ark, because design-wise it's very interesting. Noah's Ark had been redesigned for every religion. Like, it's in the Old Testament, it's a box. It's in the Bible, it's a little bit fleshed out, but it's not really a ship. If you look at in Quran, it's almost like a ship. And if you look at in Hollywood, it's like 3G, like super computer-generated ultimate vehicle. And so I decided that maybe my vehicle of isolation is a virtual reality headset that, helps us, like, protects from the environment and, like, isolates us and, tells the story of our humanity.
Yeah, no, that's actually very interesting, because I was thinking precisely that nuclear power plants, the atomic bomb, or catastrophe environments or landscapes are always like in this kind of collective imaginary, and it is a way to address also some issues of environment or designing certain kind of spaces, no, through a wider public, no. How did you deal with these kind of images, no? Because they could be like super powerful as a promise of the future, no? Like even in the 50s and 60s, but also at the same time they could be like extremely terrifying, no? They could be like extremely menacing.
Yeah, I try to steer away from romanticism of the catastrophe, because I think it's a way of like creating a speculation or like creating a spectacularity out of the disasters, and I try to steer away from that, and I try to organize things like almost like an archaeologue, creating some sort of a three-dimensional structure in which we can look at space and underground, like in layers, and also time-wise, I try to organize everything, as it dates back to geologic times, and it's in the future, like 240,000 years forward. So I try to be as systematic as possible, as much as an archaeologue. And as it comes to dealing with the scientific images, I try to demystify their strength as scientific images, because I think scientists, as subjective as artists, I mean, yes, they rely on hard fact data, but still they're like human, and they make very subjective decisions in terms of visualizing their research or telling their stories, and they make extreme subjective decisions when they choose a subject to research more. Like, for example, Madame Curie, like, who is one of the pioneer nuclear researchers, lost her fingers because it was an obsession with the plutonium that she was researching. And so I think they're very emotional and subjective people as much as the artists. So I try to demystify the scientific part as much as possible, and also by doing so, I think I was relying on the mythical aspects of nuclear science, because it's very hard to say like nuclear science is really scientific, because it's not really open to experimentation, because we don't really have an experiment time span for 240,000 years. So it's as speculative as the Noah's Ark, maybe.
Okay, just to finish, I would like to ask you about this transnational reality, that it is, in a way, this mutant space, no? Because through your work, we could see that it's going from Chernobyl in Ukraine, to Onkalo in Finland, Hanford site in the United States, or Metsamor in Armenia, no? So I would like to ask you about this kind of transnational reality. No?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's extremely transnational in terms of its impact. When Chernobyl happened, Finland was one of the most affected countries. And when Hanford site started, Russia just wanted to respond back with more nuclear research in Ukraine and in Armenia, which was the Soviet Republic at the time. And so their impacts are obviously like cross-national. And this recent situation with Armenia and the Turkish border is also, it's just like 30 kilometers away from the Turkish border, but because of the conflict of the, acknowledging the genocide, and there's a closed border, and we can't really discuss these kind of vital issues that we should be discussing with the Armenians in Turkey. So everything is like kind of click to that, one political statement that Turkish people are not acknowledging, and then all these more important issues, which is the home base for the next genocide in the region, is not discussed. On the other hand, in the European Union, there are better examples in which, like for example, Austria can force Slovenia to shut down a nuclear power plant in order to join the EU, or the relationship between Finland and Russia has drastically changed after Chernobyl. So this is obviously like physically a very transnational issue. On the other hand, all these nuclear lobbies are on the same boat, and once there's Fukushima, the investment in Finland is affected. When there's like a problem in Indian nuclear reactor, the Turkish investments kind of stop. So it's kind of an interesting relationship between the countries, which are held together by the nuclear lobbies in the world.
Okay, many thanks.
Thank you.